Welcome, everybody. So good to have you with us. We are here this morning for demystifying subdivision regulations, reducing sprawl development and forest fragmentation. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I'm going to be doing the first little section of this just to give a little context. But the main act this morning is Jason Rasmussen, the Executive Director of the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission, forgive me. Great to have you with us, Jason. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with this first section, and then we can turn it over. All right. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Want to make sure we're all on the same page. Where you've already passed the first test of joining the Microsoft Teams webinar. Please do mute your microphones and go ahead and turn off your videos until the end so that it'll save you on bandwidth. If you'd also please find the chat button. We're going to be giving information to you via the chat. It's also your opportunity to ask questions while the presentation is going on. And we'll stop several times over the course of the presentation to read the questions from the chat. If you're having problems using the chat at the end, there might be time to unmute your mic and ask questions that way. But generally, the chat is the safest way. If you would go ahead and introduce yourselves on the chat by putting in your name and the town, and if you work on any town commissions or something like that, that would be great. We'd love to have you introduce yourselves. And again, we'll be dividing the sections, we'll be dividing the webinar up into different sections, and you'll see these prompts come up next up on each of the question slides. And so you'll know where we are. I'm going to begin by giving an overview of forest fragmentation and make the case for why pattern in the landscape is so important. And then Jason will take over and talk about planning and zoning in general and give an introduction there, but then really dive in on what is subdivision and what can it do. So that's the plan for the morning. Before I get too far along, I just want to make sure you all know where I'm coming from. I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. That's a huge mission. It takes us in a lot of different directions. Our piece of that is Lincoln Frasca, who's on the back end of this morning's webinar, and myself make up the department's community wildlife program. And we provide municipal technical assistance to all the towns in Vermont and regional planning commissions. Generally, we help interpret the science and provide maps and really help transform that science into ways that the planning commission can handle it. So interpreting it, simplifying the maps and so forth. We work very closely with the regional planning commissions, and they are, of course, the premier deliverer of technical assistance. So when it comes to the writing of the town plan language and writing of the bylaws, they're your best help for that type of technical assistance. But we often work hand in hand in terms of providing that scientific understanding. So we do presentations and workshops like this. We also create and interpret resources, and our help is not limited to webinars like this. So we're happy to work with your town. Okay, so big picture, let's just start with this understanding of forests and where you have forests in your town, particularly connected forests, intact forests, diverse forests. Where you have forest in your town is really an important first step in thinking about land use planning for natural resources. And so bigger blocks of forest in your town offer more benefits than smaller blocks. So the undeveloped landscape provides rural character. So those bigger blocks of forest are part of that. They're, of course, integral to scenery and places for recreation. And so here, there's not only that ecological benefit, but also a community benefit and an economic return that comes with that. Of course, the larger forest blocks help clean air and clean the water. They prevent erosion and reduce flooding. They sequester carbon and absorb harmful gases, critically important part of our climate change planning. They provide shade. So even in the village center, our forests or even rows of street trees are helping. But the shade along the rivers helps cool the water and adds for more species diversity. Larger forest blocks prevent respiratory ailments. And of course, there's that connection to human health and places of refuge. You know, certainly during the COVID pandemic, we've been flocking to our forests as an escape from everyday life. Intact forests transmit fewer tick-borne illnesses. And of course, they offer an economic return in terms of timber production. So there's this myriad of benefits we get from our forests, and we get more benefits from larger forest blocks. Now, one important piece of this is we're going to have more biological diversity in larger forest blocks than we do in smaller forest blocks. So you can think about it this way. This is research done in Maine. It's certainly applicable here in Vermont. And so at the bottom axis, you see the size of the forest block with a huge, undeveloped, many thousands of acre type forest block at left, and a 1 to 20 acre block completely surrounded at right. And then the y-axis is the number of species that you can expect. And so as we compare that undeveloped block of what a full range of species with a small, completely isolated forest block, there's a direct correlation. Bigger forests, more species diversity. Smaller, isolated forests, less species diversity. And so really you're left with squirrels, raccoons, and skunks in those most isolated for tiny forest blocks. And so there's this correlation. Now, there's a little wrinkle here. The Champlain Valley, the Connecticut River valleys, they are lower elevation. So there's actually more biological diversity at lower elevation than there is at higher elevation. Excuse me. So let's not compare the Champlain Valley towns with the spine of the Greens, but within your town, bigger forest blocks, more species diversity. So the pattern, the relative connectedness of these forest blocks matters a great deal. At left, you see that the area of Killington and Bridgewater. The light green is deciduous forest, trees that lose their leaves. The dark green are coniferous forests, evergreens. And so you can see the pattern that there are fewer roads, there's more intact forest there at left. At right is Heartland, and it is a rural town, no zoning. You can see that they're smaller chunks of forest. They're bigger patches of open areas. And so you can expect less species diversity in those smaller chunks than you do in the bigger chunks. So we know that this process of moving from larger forest blocks as they get divided into smaller and smaller forest blocks, that's called forest fragmentation. And we know that there are effects on the landscape from forest fragmentation. As the blocks get smaller and smaller, practicing forestry becomes operationally difficult and culturally unacceptable. We know it degrades the recreational experience. When I hike the Long Trail and I have to come down off the hill and go cross a road, you lose some of that mystery, that magical sense of being in nature. Smaller forest blocks offer less soil infiltration, so the water is more likely to go over the surface, pick up speed, and you're going to have more erosion. As we get smaller forest blocks, they're going to release more carbon stored in soils and vegetation, and that reduces the capacity to store carbon, which is so important for mitigating the impacts of climate change. As our blocks move from bigger and bigger to smaller and smaller, animals are going to have to cross the roads more to use those habitats in different forest blocks. And so we're going to increase the amount of wildlife vehicle collisions. and it modifies animal behavior. I'm going to pick up more on this point in a moment. And of course, that reduces the human health benefits from forests, and we lose something of what makes Vermont, Vermont. So we know there's a problem with a trend towards forest fragmentation. But let me add another wrinkle. With climate change, we're making that problem of forest fragmentation worse. So here's what we're expecting in Vermont with climate change already. Average air temperatures have increased 4 degrees in the winter. Spring is arriving 2 weeks earlier. We're seeing increases in annual precipitation. And often I might say that the quick way of saying it is Vermont can expect warmer and wetter. But the truth is more complicated than that, because we're going to have short-term droughts in some places and not in others. And so we have disproportionate effects on Vermonters and the environment in some locations more than others. So changes are already underway, and we can't just look at carbon mitigation side of climate change, but also need to address adaptation. We know that the effects of climate are disproportionately affecting some Vermonters more than others. And so our frontline communities, BIPOC Vermonters, low-income Vermonters are more likely to feel the impacts of climate change. And so there's this disproportionality across the landscape and across our people. Also with climate change, we're seeing a movement on the landscape in terms of whole species. This image represents several thousand, 2,950 species, and the model for where they need to move to adjust their ranges in the face of a warming climate. Now you can see how so much of this movement is bottlenecked through the Northeast and through Vermont in particular. The Nature Conservancy estimates that whole populations are adjusting their range north and south away from the equator on average a mile per year. And so there's tremendous movement. It's not just north-south movement. Some of it is upslope. Some of it is a bit more southwest to northeast. And so it's really complicated understanding the range of adaptation that's happening, but it is happening. So here in Vermont, we look to what you see on screen is the Vermont Conservation Design as an indication of the lands and waters that are most important to maintain for ecological function now and into the future. And so we can think about this design of intact, connected forests and waters. And so, there are certain places where wildlife are moving more often. There are these highways of wildlife movement. But again, the pattern is much more complicated than this. It's much more local. We have wildlife road crossings, one animal at a time moving across roads in different sections. And so the pattern of movement is more complicated, but there are these major connection points that allow for movement. And so again, this pattern of a connected landscape becomes incredibly important for wildlife to adjust their ranges, to meet their everyday needs, and also to respond to climate change. Now, wildlife aren't the only things moving. People are also on the move. In response to the COVID pandemic, in response to climate change, folks are moving to Vermont. So what you see on screen is the Vermont residential property sales to out-of-state buyers. And between 2019 and 2020, we saw an increase of 1,000 residential property sales. So there's this spike in people moving here. And that's fine as long as we have a plan for where to put people. If we don't have a plan and regulation to control where those new units go, and essentially we're leaving it up to everyone else to decide what that land use pattern is going to look like. So the Vermont brand of living that rural lifestyle sends a message to folks who are moving here that you can put a house wherever. And so then we run into that problem of increasing forest fragmentation. So if you do a simple Google search on safest states for climate change, Vermont shows up in the top 3 on this particular website. So we know we have flooding and we continue to get flooding, but overall, Vermont still ranks as one of the safest states. So folks from the semi-arid West, folks who are experiencing fires and catastrophic flooding in California are looking to safer places to move, and Vermont ranks high on that list. So again, the pattern that we need to maintain on the landscape is really important, and we're getting a lot of pressure from people moving around. The problem is we've really embraced sprawl development. I mentioned that Vermont brand, and in some ways you could say that the Vermont brand is rural sprawl. It's auto-dependent strip development outside of compact urban and village centers. So we say we want that compact village development surrounded by farms and forests, but what's actually happening on the ground is more sprawl. Residential development in Vermont occurs at low densities. It's mostly in rural areas. It's mostly in our agricultural and rural residential districts. Regrettably, it's not happening as much as it should in our existing downtowns, village centers, or planned growth areas. Vermont Natural Resources Council estimates that only about 2% of the subdivision that occurs in Vermont actually triggers Act 250. So those town regulations, those town tools like subdivision and zoning matter a great deal for how we maintain this connected pattern into the future. All right, so I just want to reinforce the pattern that we're looking for. So here's an aerial photo, and so you can think about, well, first we want to identify those core forest blocks, those largest forest blocks that are critically important anchors. But then we want to identify a subset of smaller forests that are serving as stepping stones. You can't get from the left side of the picture on screen to the right side without using the middle block as a bit of a stepping stone. So it's not as big as the other forests, and yet its location makes it critically important. So that's one type of connector. Then there are also wildlife road crossings and the riparian network that are kind of micro connectors. Forgive me, riparian meaning streamside vegetation. And so we can think about those sorts of connectors and this larger pattern. Okay, so that's my section. I'll turn this over to Jason. You can go ahead and share your screen. But in the meantime, Lincoln, any questions for me from the chat?
Thanks, Jens. We don't have questions in the chat as of now, but several folks joined during your presentation. So please direct your comments and questions into the chat. We'll take those at breaks, and also look out for some links that I'll be loading in to complement the slides as Jason goes along here.
Great. Thank you so much. Jason, over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Jens. I'm a kind of newbie on this end of things with Teams, so I'm hoping that you're seeing my slides.
Yes, you're all set.
Good. So I'm Jason Rasmussen. I'm with the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission. I've been I'm reasonably new in my current position as executive director, but I've been doing transportation and land use planning for 23 years. And I've spent quite a few years working with subdivision specifically. So there's no easy answers on subdivision and making it work for reducing forest fragmentation, or else we wouldn't be talking about the problems of parcelization and forest fragmentation in the state. So there's no silver bullets, but I'm going to try to help you to understand subdivision better and consider some tools that might help. So there are 11 regional planning commissions in the state of Vermont. This image on the right of your screen shows you where those are. We are political subdivisions of the state. We really exist primarily to work with our member towns. We help with a lot of different planning asks, specifically mapping natural resource planning, land use planning, but also we do a lot of work with transportation, with housing, economic development, and a bunch of other topics. So we work very closely with Fish and Wildlife staff on this sort of thing. So you know, Jens and Lincoln are wonderful assets, and we work with them to understand the science better and help to apply this kind of information for our towns, whether they're doing a town plan or subdivision or zoning bylaws or anything like that. As you can see on the map, Mount Ascutney Regional Commission, we're pretty small. We end up working quite closely with our towns. And so over the years, you know, we've done an awful lot of work on town plans, zoning, and subdivision bylaws. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about planning and zoning basics. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly, but if there's questions, put them in the chat. So what is planning? I mean, at its most basic level, it's just thinking ahead. You know, if you have, say, a house, you know, you got to figure out, oh, geez, I got to paint it. I got roof issues. I've got furnace, you know, what do I need to do? What's my plan to attack those things and get them done? It's essentially the same thing for the town. You know, in a municipal planning context, you're thinking about, you know, what's the future of our town? What's our vision? And, you know, what can we reasonably do to achieve it? So, you know, at a very simple level, that's planning. The image there on the right of the screen is from the Vermont Planning Manual. I think it's also in the Act 171 guidance document as well. You know, that it's a circular process. You know, often our planning commissions are like, oh, we got to update our town plan again. Yes, you do. Every 8 years at least. But it, you know, it's circular in that you know you do your planning, then you try to implement your plan, and then you know you review it and you start all over again. And so every 8 years or so, you're kind of usually going through that cycle. There's a number of tools to implement your plan. Over you know the last 5 years or so, we've I think all embraced trying to implement the plan more. Many of us are tired of plans just collecting dust on the shelf, so we're trying to be more implementation focused. That can be done either through regulations or it can be done through other non-regulatory things, such as you know what you're seeing on the screen there. I just want to make a note. You might hear regulation, you might hear ordinance, you might hear bylaw. You know, in this context, Vermont planning law, you know, really bylaw is the term of art. But when you might hear me say regulation or bylaw, it's really the same thing as far as what I'm talking about here today. You know, we're going to talk more specifically about subdivision, but all these other tools can work together. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But zoning, subdivision, if you have an official map for future roads, that sort of thing, they all work together. So why have a plan? Having a municipal plan is optional, but if a town chooses to have one, then you need to meet all the requirements under state law. You know, Vermont is a Dillon's rule state. It's not a home rule state. What that really means is towns are enabled by state law to do things. And so we're always looking to what does the enabling statute tell us that we can do? And so, you know, again, town plans are optional, but if you do one, you must meet all the required elements. I think, now I'm a planner, so I'm a little biased. I think a town plan is probably one of the more important functions that a town planning commission can do. You know, it documents existing conditions. You know, it identifies that future vision for the community, and it guides future growth in a way that tries to achieve that vision. So again, I think that's really valuable. You know, again, I think the plans, just the virtue of planning is very helpful because, you know, it's really trying to inform how the community is going to make some day-to-day decision making in a way that kind of gets you to that end goal. I'm not going to read all this stuff on the slide. But the town plan can be helpful. You might find that you need to go in a little deeper dive. You might need what's called a supporting plan. You might want a forest fragmentation plan to kind of get a little more information on that particular topic to supplement your town plan. The town plan also serves as sort of the basis for subdivision zoning and other bylaws. So, what the policies say in the plan really helps to guide what the subdivision should try to do. It also has, if you have clear and mandatory language, and that's a whole other conversation, it can have effect in Act 250 decisions. It can have effect in Section 248 for solar projects and things like that. And if for some reason you allow your plan to expire and you have subdivision bylaws, you're not able to amend them until you update and adopt a new plan. So, there's some real practical reasons for keeping it up to date. Not the least of which is amending your regulations. So municipal plan requirements. I mentioned if you have one, you got to do certain things. So you're supposed to be consistent with state planning goals. There's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of those state planning goals. I'm highlighting 2 of them here because in this context, these are probably the 2 more relevant ones. So supposed to maintain that historic settlement pattern here in Vermont of compact villages and surrounded by rural countryside. The image on the right is sort of our region's idea of trying to, make some sense of what that looks like. So this is from our regional plan. The conservation image on the top is sort of the least developed part of the region, and then the town and regional centers at the bottom is our most developed, and sort of everything in between. The way we in our region are thinking of it, the top 3 categories are sort of our rural countryside, so to speak. So that, in terms of our planning efforts, that's what we're looking at relative to that goal. And let's see, we also need to follow smart growth. Development should be undertaken in ways that follow smart growth principles. And there's a definition there in that section 2791 if you want. But generally speaking, it's more that same language, the historic settlement patterns, compact mixed-use centers. We want growth that's not characterized by forest fragmentation. We want to strengthen forest industry, etc. There's other stuff in there, but that's what we're striving for. And then again, the Act 171, you'll hear a little bit more about that soon. But that amended the state planning goals a few years ago. We need to now really look at Vermont forest lands in ways to, maintain and improve forest blocks and habitat connectors. And that's part of, I think, the main discussion here today. Okay, so required elements. So there's a list of 12 elements that you are required to address, unless for some reason they're not applicable in your town. So land use and policies on preserving rare and natural areas are 2 of those required elements, and those relate back to this forest fragmentation issue. And so your town plan really needs to have a future land use plan that speaks to where are the forest blocks, where are the habitat connectors, how are you going to maintain them, and sort of minimize that fragmentation. So again, the plan is where you have that conversation and figure out what that means in your community. So I just mentioned the Act 171. That was enacted in 2016. It amended the Vermont Planning and Development Act, and it added some of those required elements that I just talked about. It applies to all plans that are adopted after January of 2018. So most town plans now have some kind of forest block language in it, but there might be a few out there that are scrambling to add it as they're updating the plans now because it's now a required thing. And the image on the right is something that Agency of Natural Resources developed. The Act 171 guidance document is really an excellent guide. So I would encourage folks to go check that out. It's very helpful. Okay, so zoning and subdivision, basically this table summarizes some of the regulatory implementation tools. The top number of rows here are zoning elements that are optional. Flood hazard areas sometimes are included in a what we call a unified bylaw. Sometimes they're a standalone bylaw, and then subdivision down below. This chart really is just trying to give you a sense of what the various tools are and who does them. Where you're seeing in that right column, AMP, that means appropriate municipal panel. That could be a planning commission, it could be a zoning board, it could be a development review board, depending on the town and what the bylaws say, who's responsible for which review process. So generally speaking, zoning is regulates the location, type, and density of development. It usually establishes one or more zoning districts, and each zoning district would have its own specific standards for minimum lot size or density or setbacks or other dimensional standards like that. So the creation of lots through a subdivision process have to meet those zoning requirements. Subdivision is really about the control of the pattern of development. So, what are the lot layout? How are lots configured? How is access to those lots going to work? Where are the utilities, power, wastewater, how's that going to work, for these new lots? And that's the process. The subdivision process is when we think about those things. Usually, again, it sort of depends on each town and how the bylaws call it out, but most towns, it's either the planning commission that does the subdivision review or the development review board. There might be a couple towns that have their zoning board doing that as well. But you can specify that in your bylaws. And I won't get into it too much, but there's some waiver options in subdivision that are much more broad than the zoning waivers. So your bylaws can waive any or all requirements when appropriate. And so, the bylaw should specify when and how that would work. So I don't want to talk much about zoning, but I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of, again, when you're creating a new lot in subdivision, you do need to go back and understand what the dimensional standards are for the zoning district that it's located in and that sort of thing. So, you often have some kind of a dimensional standard table like this in a zoning bylaw, if you have them. You can still have subdivision if you don't have zoning, in which case this doesn't really apply. But most of our towns, they have both. And so, you would go back to the zoning and you'd understand what the zoning district requirements are for minimum lot size or density, setbacks, and all that sort of a thing. There is a difference between minimum lot size and density. In my opinion, out in the rural part of town where there's forest blocks and that sort of thing, I don't really like minimum lot size. I tend to prefer the density standard. It enables some flexibility, so you can do a little bit more like you're seeing in that image in the middle, as opposed to, let's say you had a minimum lot size of 5 acres or 10 acres, whatever it is, you're going to have something more like on the right-hand side that really only just functions to parcelize the lots in the rural part of town. So I like the idea of density better, but it's not as easy to administer. There are some headaches associated with that, but I won't get really into too much of that here. But again, subdivision needs to take whatever those dimensional standards in mind when they're creating new lots. And I guess one other note, I mean, if you're in, say, a conservation district or the forest district or something like that, you know, larger lots are really what we're shooting for. You know, 50 acres or more are going to be, you know, where forestry activities are more likely to happen. Once you start carving them up into 20, 10, 5-acre chunks, it becomes really kind of useless for forestry. And like Jens was talking about, you know, we're really trying to get at intact forest blocks of large size for all those functions he was talking about. So a lot of times our town standards are not quite getting us there. Lincoln, do we have any questions?
There is some activity in the chat, some resources to go along with the slides as well about inclusionary zoning that was brought up in the chat. And then there is a question for you, Jason, directly. So how do the ADU, accessory dwelling units, impact zoning and density?
So, so ADU, so for those who don't know, accessory dwelling units are now enabled or required, I guess, under law. So anytime there's a single family house, you're enabled to have an accessory dwelling unit. Usually in zoning, that does not impact the density standards. And so basically wherever you have a house, you can have an ADU. So you're kind of doubling the number of units by virtue of that, if you will. But usually it's either within or close to that house. And so hopefully, hopefully you're not seeing a lot of forest impacts as a result of that, but it's possible that you would. Is there anything else?
Jesse just has a comment to go along with that the promotion of ADUs can increase positive density around town centers, and it can provide more attainable dwellings for those that live alone and are wish to age in place, which can then enable more housing stock for families.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, they technically can happen anywhere. So it could be in our most rural part of town. There are issues with septic and other things like that that make that a little harder to do, and it's a little more likely to happen where there's water and sewer and that sort of thing, but they could happen anywhere. Obviously, we have a housing crisis going on, and so ADUs help us to address that. So, you know, largely they're a good thing, but they could happen wherever there's a house.
All right, with that, back to the slides.
Okay. And incidentally, I hope we're doing okay for time. Yeah, I think we're good. So what is subdivision? It's basically it's an optional tool. And it really is as simple as when a parcel is divided into 2 or more pieces, whether it's for sale or development or lease. And so it's really when those lots are getting broken up into chunks, where are the chunks? You know, what shape are they? How is the access to them? How are utilities you know, going to be provided to those houses? That sort of thing. So the image on the right is sort of a kind of a suburban-esque version of it. But you know, generally speaking, you want some kind of a logical pattern, good safe access, and those sorts of things. The image on the bottom there is sort of, you know, the lots are regular. Access, you probably can't see it too well, but the access is really a hodgepodge and not very well thought through. And in fact, all of that is on prime ag soil. So I couldn't find good images for forest blocks. So anyway, it's sort of a bad example, if you will, in the bottom picture there in terms of bad access. They could have had smaller lots. It's really cutting up natural resources in unfortunate ways. But again, this is the subdivision process. and it really guides the community settlement patterns and ensures efficient extension of services, utilities, roads, access roads, that sort of thing. We've in our region, and I think in many other places, we tend to see very small subdivisions, 1 lot, 2 lots at a time. They have tended to be in our most rural areas, not really necessarily where we want them, where there's water and sewer and things like that. So they have had incremental over time. They've been chipping away at the force blocks, and that's not really what we want. And so it is difficult to deal with it, though, because it is happening at these small incremental scales. So we're going to talk a little bit more about trying to address that. Just as an example, this is a larger subdivision, but this is what it might look like. I'm hoping most of you have seen these sorts of things before, but in essence, you have the parent parcel, I'll call it, and then the proposed smaller new parcels that are going to be created within it, road networks, how's the septic going to work, how's the power line going to work, etc. But I won't dwell on that. Here's a bad example. I don't know who thought these lots made sense. So somebody created these wild lots over in here, which really, I mean, this is a large, important priority forest block, and these were created many, many years ago. These lots are, I mean, back here, they're completely useless. They're cutting up the land. There's no point of, no future potential of forestry back in there. They created these little lollipop things for access, but then decided to ignore them. They're just terrible. And this is the kind of thing that we don't want to see happen. So I think sometimes the bad examples are more helpful than the good examples to take a look at. And here's another goofy one, totally in the middle of nowhere. There's no access whatsoever. I don't know why these lots were created. I don't know what could actually happen up in there. They're pretty big, though, I'll say that. But also having this very strange, irregularly shaped lot, it really makes it such that the average person who owns it is going to be really hard to even find the boundaries. So there's some real practical reasons for the subdivision process and trying to create logical lots that make sense, that you have access to, that you can actually find the corners of the property and and so forth, so you're not building on your neighbor's land by mistake or something like that. And of course, we're trying to avoid more parcelization and forest fragmentation. So subdivision bylaws are enabled under this section 4418, part of Title 24. And it shall contain those 4 elements. You need to have procedures. What's that process look like to approve a subdivision? You need to have standards for infrastructure and utilities. So, roads, power, wastewater, all that kind of stuff. You need to have some standards for that. What's the design and configuration of lots? So that likely refers back to the zoning to some extent. You also might have standards about you needing to avoid irregularly shaped lots and things of that nature. And you also need to have standards for the protection of natural resources, and that would include forest blocks and habitat connectors. So you need to have standards for natural resources. The Act 171 changes want us to plan for a lot, not fragmenting our forests. So subdivision really should have some language in there about forest fragmentation and how you're going to try to avoid that. And then subdivision may include these other things. And I'm going to really skip over that because they're not super relevant to this right now. So what can subdivision do? Again, it works hand in hand with zoning. The dimensional standards in zoning, tells us at least the minimum size of those lots that can be created in subdivision. But subdivision can also have a bunch of standards. Usually there's some conformance with the town plan. It might refer to the capital budget and program in terms of extension of facilities and services. There's a number of things that you might want to consider, including you could have district settlement pattern language where, let's say, if you're in the forest district, it must do X, Y, and Z. And it can enable, a number of different things like development envelopes or cut zones and a whole bunch of things like that. I'm going to talk about a few of them, but I'm not going to really be able to talk about all of them today. One thing you might want to consider for the subdivision process is to do the basics right, though, before I get into the next section. Include forest block language. Define what that is. So, either have a good definition of a forest block or map them. You could define them based on like what the 171 guidance suggests. So, for example, highest priority interior forest blocks and highest priority connectivity blocks as shown in BioFinder or something like that. You really ought to be very clear where these are. And then you also need to probably specify that the application needs to show them. So come in, show us where the forest blocks are and in relation to the new lots that are being proposed. And then I think it's a good idea to enable the board, whatever board is doing the review, to either potentially require additional information, let's say an analysis conducted by a qualified professional biologist or somebody, or it might enable the Conservation Commission or something like that, if you have one, to review the application and make a recommendation to the board before they go ahead and make a decision. I think those are, so again, do the basics right. I would say those are some of the basics in this context. So forest land preservation, you should have some kind of a standard in your subdivision bylaws for this, now that we have Act 171. Again, there should be some reference to where they are. So this happens to be an image from BioFinder of those priority forest block areas. And you should have some language such as those bullets. You need to, the applicant must demonstrate that you're not causing fragmentation. Subdivision boundaries and lot configurations, need to avoid, really unnecessarily breaking up the forest blocks. Some indication of how you go about doing that. So locate to the periphery, maintain the functionality of those intact forest blocks, that sort of thing. You need some kind of guidance for the average applicant so they understand what you're asking. Yeah, I think that's it. Some illustrations or photos or something can be helpful so folks can get a much better understanding of what you mean by some of your standards. So again, I couldn't find good forest block specific graphics. Maybe some of you have those, but take some pictures of what you like. Take some pictures of what you don't like, or find some graphics such as these. And just make sure that if they're in the bylaws, just say these are illustrations. This is not in and of itself a standard. They're just here to help you understand the concepts. We want this, not that. So again, I think these are really helpful. You can, again, a lot of subdivision bylaws say something like you have to be in conformance with the town plan. You could point specifically to a map in the town plan, such as this one in Windsor. It shows you this is where the forest blocks are. This is where the habitat connectivity, we think, happens. And this particular map, we worked with the town on with Fish and Wildlife's help. And I think something like that it just makes it very, very clear to an applicant, this is where they are. And then the policy language in the town plan could potentially help them to better understand what you're getting at, but hopefully the standard is clearer. The standard in the subdivision bylaws themselves is clear and concise. You don't perhaps need that context, but it can sometimes help. Another thing you might want to consider is in the rural parts of town, we've got some really big lots, and where there's either the concept for multiple phased subdivisions over time that an applicant expresses, or you think there's just they're coming in for only 1 or 2 lots now, but there's a potential for a lot more up in there, and it's a important forest block. You may want to at least enable the board, in this case, the Development Review Board, to require a conceptual master plan. And you might want to be really specific about when, like, okay, if you're in the forest district and if it's a lot of 50 acres or more, or whatever the number is that works for you, this will be required potentially. And this is a terrible image from a really old master plan, but really, you're trying to get a good, well thought out plan for not only what they want to do today, but also incorporates the potential down the road, and ultimately preserves forest blocks, or at least minimizes fragmentation of them. So a lot of subdivision bylaws either require or enable the development of development envelopes where there are natural resources that need to be protected. This just happens to be an image that sort of gets at that. So a development envelope is sort of that, you see on here, the buildable area. So in this context, it's basically just the setbacks, but you might have, some forest blocks or some other wildlife habitat areas that you exclude from a development envelope. So you're basically putting on the plat, this is the square or whatever area within which you need to develop. There's no development allowed outside of that development envelope. You can potentially get as specific as having a building footprint established in a subdivision. Usually we're seeing more the development envelope, but it could be either way. So I think that's a very powerful tool. One of the tricks with that is subdivisions run with the land, and so it could be 20 years later that it gets developed, and you need to have the subdivision approval, you need to have deed language, you need something so that people know and remember that you've established that development envelope and that the new house at that point 20 years down the road is in the right spot, or you got to do an amendment. So that was it. There's a lot more we could talk about, but that was it. And there's a whole bunch of resources that I think you've also seen elsewhere. So I'm going to stop sharing, I think. And Lincoln, do we have any questions?
Not in the chat. Penny, thank you for your email. I did see some people might be having trouble accessing the chat. We have a few minutes left if people want to either load something into the chat now if you can, or you can unmute and ask a live question. This would be the time.
Hi, it's Sharon Mount. I just was wondering if you could suggest resources in terms of solar panel fields and what the commission's been approached by some concerned residents who there's some proposal, and I don't have the details, but we're not talking about 3 solar panels, we're talking about a whole field, and I just don't know where to start in educating myself as to what control towns may have over, fields like industrial size solar fields, if you have any thoughts or can point me in the right direction, that'd be great. And it was a really nice presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. So, towns have an option to create an enhanced energy plan. You don't have to have an enhanced version. You could have just simply an energy chapter in your town plan. But I think that's a good place to really spell out, what you want and where you want it. There have been, I think of Bennington. I think the Bennington town plan does a pretty good job of dealing with solar siting. So you might want to check them out. And I think, again, you really just want to have some clear language. We want them here, we don't want them there. These are the type of resources we want to protect, including priority forest blocks. And honestly, we've had a lot more influence in the preferred siting process as opposed to the actual Section 248 process. So most solar projects go to the town and the regional planning commission and ask for a letter of preferred site determination. We've had a lot more influence there, so I would suggest that's a good time to work with them to avoid impacts on forest blocks and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Penny, and then I'll address the chat.
Jason, I just have a quick question. Thank you very much for the presentation. Both yours and Jens were very interesting. In your municipalities, how many typically, or how many require the town to vote on the town plan, and how many require the town community members to vote on any changes to the zoning regulations?
At this point, none. We did have one town that required the town plan vote to be by, at town meeting. There's some pluses and minuses, but as far as I'm concerned, it is clunky. It takes forever, and it's difficult to make amendments and things like that. So all of our towns at this point are voting. The select boards are voting, or the village trustees are voting to adopt those documents.
Thank you, Jason. And from the chat, would a PUD or planned unit development be an example of a master plan, or are they distinct options? District options? Distinct options.
They're a little different. PUD is it does a lot of similar things that I was talking about. So a planned unit development is usually a provision in your zoning, and it often has some natural resource protections that you have to do. Sometimes there's an affordable housing density bonus or something like that. The PUD process and the subdivision process generally happen at the same time together. It's a little bit different. Again, one of the things we were trying to do with this master plan thing is deal with that incremental piece. So when we have really big lots that we know have valuable resources on them, and they may only be coming in to create 2 new lots today, there are times when we really wanted them to think more about, future development potential, and try to have a cohesive idea of how to do that better. And it is a different thing than the PUD, but I think there's some value to it, but you can't do it everywhere. I think you got to be selective.
Thanks, Jason. So we are at the top of the hour here at 11. Don had their hand up, so let's go to Don and finish it off there.
Hello, I'm curious if you can expand on density definitions. How to use
Density.
that language.
So when I was talking about the lot size versus density, is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Well, yeah, it can be confusing to the average person. Yeah, I think you need some really strong definitions to really clarify what you're talking about. And I think examples, the illustrations or photos often help. Minimum lot size is very, I think, generally clear to everybody. So if you have 5-acre minimum lot size, okay, I understand that. The density thing is really like 1 unit per 5 acre. thing. And you should have some clear definition of what that means. And again, I think illustrations work a lot of magic to help people understand what that is. You know, where I was coming from earlier, and I know we're out of time, is that, you know, if you had a 50-acre lot and there's a 10-acre minimum lot size, you know, you could have 5 lots. But if you had 1 unit per 10-acre density standard instead of the minimum lot size, you might be able to create a lot of those lots much smaller and maintain a lot of the back acreage, so to speak, intact for biodiversity. And so I like the density standard because of that.
Great. Jason, I just wanted to jump in, and again, thank you so much for this awesome webinar. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone here really enjoyed it. We did record it, and we're also offering another session of this same webinar. So if there are folks on your commissions or in your region that wanted to make it today but weren't able, we'll certainly include. There is another opportunity. But I think we should go. Jason, again, thank you, and have a great day, everybody.